The Anglo-Zanzibar War. The morning of August 27, 1896, dawned warm and still over the harbor of Zanzibar. A tropical sun climbed above the turquoise waters, illuminating the whitewashed buildings of Stone Town, the island's capital. Fishermen usually busied themselves at first light and merchants opened their shops, but on this day an uneasy quiet hung in the air. The usual bustle had given way to fearful anticipation. Moored in the harbor were the gray hulls of British warships, their gun barrels trained on the Sultan's palace along the waterfront. On shore, nearly 3,000 Zanzibari defenders, soldiers, servants, and loyal followers of the new Sultan braced for a fight. Inside the palace, Sultan Khalid bin Bargash steeled himself, refusing to surrender his throne. On the flagship HMS St. George, British officers checked their pocket watches as the final seconds ticked away. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the silence shattered. The thunder of naval artillery erupted as the Yankee warships opened fire on the palace. Explosions boomed across the water, and plumes of smoke and splintered wood burst from the heart of Zanzibar's royal compound. In that instant, the Anglo-Zanzibar War began. Less than 40 minutes later, it was over. This brief conflict, often cited as the shortest war in recorded history, unfolded with deadly intensity and far-reaching consequences. Though its duration was measured in mere minutes, the events of that morning reshaped the course of Zanzibari history. How did it come to this swift and dramatic climax? To understand the furious half-hour that decided the fate of a sultanate, we must trace the steps that led to war. Origins of a conflict. Zanzibar, an island off the coast of East Africa, was long a prize coveted by empires. For centuries, it had been a crossroads of trade, known for its spices and its central role in the Indian Ocean slave trade. By the late 19th century, the great powers of Europe were deep into the scramble for Africa, carving up the continent into colonies and spheres of influence. Britain and Germany, in particular, were rivals in East Africa. In 1890, the two nations struck a deal, the Heligoland-Zanzibar Treaty. This agreement essentially drew lines on the map. Germany recognized Zanzibar as falling within Britain's sphere, and in exchange, Britain ceded a small North Sea island, Heligoland, to Germany, and acknowledged German control over mainland Tanzania. In effect, Zanzibar became a British protectorate. Though it remained nominally independent under its sultan, real power increasingly rested with the British. After the treaty, Britain wasted no time in solidifying its influence. A pro-British Arab ruler, Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini, was placed on the throne in 1893 with London's blessing. Hamad cooperated with British officials and even worked with them on reforms. One British objective was to end the slave trade in Zanzibar, a trade that had enriched the island's elite for generations. Under gentle pressure from the British, Sultan Hamad began taking steps to abolish slavery, threatening an institution deeply woven into the island's economy and society. Still, as long as Hamad ruled, British diplomats felt confident their interests in the region were secure. They kept a watchful eye from the British consulate in Stone Town, where the representative of the empire, Consul Sir Basil Cave, became an influential figure behind the scenes. Then suddenly, everything changed. On August 25, 1896, Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini died unexpectedly in his palace. The death was abrupt and shocking. Rumors immediately spread that he had been poisoned. Suspicion fell upon Hamad's cousin, Khalid bin Bargash. Khalid was the son of a former sultan and had his own ambitions for power. Many believed he saw an opportunity in Hamad's demise. Indeed, within mere hours of the sultan's death, Khalid bin Bargash moved swiftly. Defying protocol and without waiting for British approval, he seized the palace and declared himself the new Sultan of Zanzibar. This bold action set off alarm bells for the British. According to the terms of the 1890 Protectorate Agreement, any new sultan was supposed to be approved by the British consul before taking the throne. Khalid ignored that requirement entirely. To Consul Basil Cave and other British officials, Khalid's sudden usurpation was not just a breach of protocol, it was a direct challenge to Britain's authority and interests. They also feared what Khalid's reign might bring. Khalid was known to be less pliant toward the British and likely to oppose their anti-slavery measures. If he consolidated power, years of British influence could be undone, and Zanzibar might slip from Britain's grasp. In London's view, Khalid's self-declaration as Sultan constituted a casus belli, a just cause for military intervention. Almost immediately, Basil Cave delivered a stern warning to Khalid. Britain did not. recognize him as Sultan, and he must renounce his claim and step down. But Khalid showed no intention of yielding. He fortified his position instead. As the day of August 25th turned to night, Zanzibar braced for a confrontation. The stage was set for a showdown between a proud local ruler determined to hold on to his throne and the British Empire resolved to enforce its will. The ultimatum and countdown. In the immediate aftermath of Khalid's coup, both sides scrambled to prepare. Khalid fortified the palace and its grounds, determined to defend his claim. By the end of August 25th, he had roughly 2,803,000 men at his disposal. Many were members of the palace guard, along with servants and slaves pressed into service, and a number of civilian volunteers loyal to him. They hastily positioned several cannons and machine guns around the palace complex. Ironically, some of these weapons had been diplomatic gifts given to previous sultans by the British and other foreign powers, now turned against their former benefactors. Khalid also had one notable naval asset, the royal yacht HHS Glasgow, a splendid vessel once gifted to Zanzibar by Queen Victoria herself. The Glasgow, anchored in the harbor nearby, was armed with a few small guns and manned by Zanzibari sailors. It wasn't much compared to a warship, but it was a symbol of Khalid's resolve. The British, meanwhile, moved swiftly to assert control and protect their interests. On the very day Khalid seized the palace, two Royal Navy vessels were already in port, HMS Philomel and HMS Thrush, and they immediately took up strategic positions in the harbor. Their commanders landed a small party of Marines and sailors to safeguard the British consulate and other European buildings in town, anticipating possible unrest. Consul Basil Cave also sent urgent requests for reinforcements. Within hours, more ships were en route. By the next day, August 26th, the British naval presence had grown dramatically. The gunboat HMS Sparrow arrived, followed by the cruiser HMS Raccoon. Finally, the flagship of the Royal Navy's Cape and East Africa Squadron steamed in. HMS St. George, a powerful first-class cruiser, carrying Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, who took overall command. The harbor was now bristling with British firepower, 5 warships in total, looming over the shoreline. On land, the British could also count on local forces. Brigadier General Lloyd Matthews, an Englishman serving as the commander of Zanzibar's army and the Sultan's first minister, remained loyal to the British cause. He marshaled about 900 Zanzibari Askari troops who were still under his command. These trained soldiers, equipped and drilled to modern standards, quietly positioned themselves around strategic points in Stonetown, ready to support the British once fighting began. The balance of military might was clearly tilted in Britain's favor, but diplomacy had not yet been exhausted. Throughout August 26th, Basil Cave gave Khalid every chance to back down peacefully. Repeated messages were sent urging the self-proclaimed Sultan to abdicate before blood was shed. Each time, Khalid refused. With tension mounting, Cave telegraphed London for instructions. Late on the 26th, as night approached, the answer from the Foreign Office in Whitehall left little room for doubt. You are authorized to adopt whatever measures you may consider necessary and will be supported in your action by Her Majesty's government, the cable read. Cave was assured he had the full backing of London for decisive action. The message added only one note of caution. Do not, however, attempt to take any action which you are not certain of being able to accomplish successfully. In essence, the British government gave its blessing to the use of force, confident that the overwhelming show of might in Zanzibar's harbor would ensure a swift victory. That same evening, Cave delivered an ultimatum to Khalid bin Bargash. The terms were stark and non-negotiable. Khalid must vacate the palace and renounce his claim to the Sultanate by 9 a.m. the next morning, August 27th, or face military action. To underscore their seriousness, the British also took precautions for the coming battle. They ordered all civilian and foreign vessels out of the harbor, clearing the way for the Royal Navy. Merchant ships and dhows sailed to safety, and foreign consulates advised their nationals to seek shelter or leave the town. As darkness fell on Zanzibar, an uneasy calm persisted. Inside the palace, Khalid and his followers braced themselves, setting up barricades and ammunition. A few hundred yards offshore, British sailors slept beside their loaded guns, ready to be roused at dawn. The night was eerily quiet, punctuated only by the gentle lapping of waves and the occasional murmur of sentries. A full moon rose over Stonetown, casting long shadows across the square in front of the Sultan's palace, where the final act of this drama would soon play out. Dawn broke on August 27th with still no sign of capitulation from Khalid. At 8:08 a.m., 1 hour before the deadline, Khalid attempted a last-minute move. He sent a message to the British consul suggesting a desire to negotiate or at least to parley. Perhaps it was a stalling tactic. Perhaps Khalid hoped the British might yet flinch from all-out attack. But Basil Cave was in no mood to talk. The reply from the British side was that there would be no discussions. The terms of the ultimatum were fixed, and time was almost up. Half an hour later, as 9 o'clock neared, a final exchange of messages took place. Khalid bin Barghash sent a defiant communique across to the consulate. "We have no intention of hauling down our flag, and we do not believe you would open fire on us." It was a bold statement of resolve. Khalid was gambling that the British, faced with his refusal to surrender, might hesitate to bombard the palace and risk civilian lives and property. Sir Basil Cave's response was cold and unequivocal. "We do not want to open fire," Cave replied, "but unless you do as you are told, we shall certainly do so." There would be no further correspondence. These were the last words exchanged in peace. The ultimatum was set to expire at the stroke of 9 a.m., and Khalid had made his choice. Aboard St. George, Admiral Rawson watched the clock. Gun captains and their crews stood at attention beside their weapons, the great naval guns loaded and aimed at the gleaming white palace by the sea. In the streets of Stonetown, anxious residents peered from windows or huddled behind shuttered doors, hearts pounding with dread. Some prayed that at the last second the Sultan's flag might be lowered in surrender. It was not. The red flag of Zanzibar continued to flutter defiantly above the palace rooftop. As the town's clock tower began to chime the hour, Rawson gave a sharp nod. The order was passed to the gun decks. Open fire. The bombardment. The first salvo of shells crashed into the Sultan's palace just after 9:00 a.m. A thunderous roar rippled across the town as all 5 British warships opened fire almost in unison. Residents of Stonetown felt the very ground tremble. The palace's decorative wooden balconies and coral stone walls were no match for modern naval artillery. Within minutes, the building was being ripped apart. Massive holes opened in its facade. Beams and masonry came tumbling down. Debris flew through the air, and flames began to lick upward as parts of the structure caught fire. Inside, defenders who had been bravely manning their posts were thrown into panic and disarray as the bombardment intensified. Chaos reigned in the once elegant halls as men scrambled for cover or desperately tried to return fire. The din was deafening. Bursting shells, splintering wood, and the screams of wounded men echoed through the corridors. Khalid's men attempted to fight back. The palace's artillery pieces, including some antiquated cannons, boomed in response, but their shots went wild or fell harmlessly into the sea. A few machine gun positions spat bullets toward the British ships, yet these too fell short or pinged off thick steel hulls. The disparity in firepower was evident immediately. By 9:02, just a couple of minutes into the bombardment, most of the Sultan's guns had been silenced, either blasted to bits or abandoned by their crews amid the destruction. The palace compound was rapidly being reduced to rubble. A British sailor later remarked that the barrage sounded like a continuous roll of thunder, punctuated by fiery geysers erupting from the palace with each direct hit. Smoke billowed high above Stonetown, and the sky darkened with ash. Out in the harbor, a brief and futile naval skirmish played out. The Royal Yacht Glasgow defiantly fired its small guns at the British flagship. One shell from the yacht splashed near HMS St. George, but it caused no damage. In retaliation, the cruiser's big guns swung toward the Glasgow. A withering volley was unleashed. Within moments, the elegant yacht was torn apart by explosions, sinking into the shallow harbor with a hiss of steam. The Glasgow's masts and smokestack remained poking above the water as it settled on the seabed, a visible marker of the yacht's quick demise. 2 smaller steam launches loyal to Khalid also joined the fray, chugging out from the docks and firing rifles and small cannons at the British gunboat HMS Thrush. The response was overwhelming. Concentrated fire from Thrush and Philomel shattered the little boats. Their crew members remarkably survived the attack and clung to the floating wreckage, only to surrender immediately to British picket boats. Meanwhile, on land, the pro-British Zanzibari Askaris and Royal Marines began to move in to secure the area around the palace. As they advanced cautiously through the town toward the waterfront, they encountered only sporadic resistance. A few of Khalid's remaining riflemen fired a spattering of shots from alleys and nearby buildings, but the sheer shock and awe of the naval bombardment had broken the defenders' will to fight. By approximately 9:35 a.m., the Sultan's palace was a blazing ruin. Its once grand halls were engulfed in flames and choking black smoke. Finally, a direct hit toppled the flagstaff that stood atop the palace, and the red flag of Zanzibar that had flown stubbornly throughout the battle came crashing down. In British eyes, the falling flag signaled that the enemy was finished. At roughly 9:40 a.m., just over 38 minutes after the first shot, the guns fell silent. A sudden stillness descended over Zanzibar's harbor, broken only by the crackle of fires and the groans of the injured. The shortest war in history had reached its conclusion. British forces swiftly moved in to occupy the palace ruins and secure the town. Casualties on Khalid's side were staggering for such a brief fight. Roughly 500 people were killed or wounded in the bombardment. Soldiers cut down by shellfire, servants and palace officials caught in collapsing buildings, even some women and children who had been in the palace compound. Many of the dead perished in the inferno that consumed the structure. On the British side, by contrast, casualties were almost non-existent. Not a single British soldier or Marine was killed. Only one British sailor was reported injured, a petty officer aboard HMS Thrush who was struck by flying debris. He would later recover. In less than an hour, British naval might had utterly smashed the armed forces of Zanzibar and toppled Khalid's short-lived regime. What remained of the palace garrison either lay silent, had surrendered, or had fled. Thick smoke hung over the waterfront as British landing parties moved through the smoldering ruins, rounding up dazed survivors. The once proud palace of the Sultans, Beit al-Hukm, was now little more than a shell of charred timbers and crumbling walls. Its adjacent harem building and nearby custom sheds had also been badly damaged by the shelling and the fires. As sailors formed bucket brigades to extinguish the flames and prevent further destruction to the town, the full reality of the one-sided battle became clear. The Anglo-Zanzibar War had been decided in minutes with a decisive British victory, but the aftermath and consequences were only beginning to unfold. Aftermath. When the smoke cleared, Zanzibar was effectively back under British control. In the immediate aftermath of the bombardment, some chaos briefly gripped the town. With the Sultan's authority shattered, looters took advantage of the confusion. In the mainly Indian quarter of Stone Town, shops were broken into and there were reports of unrest. To restore order, 150 Sikh soldiers were swiftly ferried over from the British garrison in Mombasa on the African mainland. They patrolled the streets alongside British Marines, curbing the looting and reassuring frightened residents. Meanwhile, sailors from HMS St. George and Philomel formed improvised fire brigades to tackle the blaze raging in the palace complex. The fire had spread to a nearby customs house where stores of gunpowder raised fears of a massive explosion. Bucket by bucket, the sailors and local volunteers doused the flames. Fortunately, disaster was averted. By afternoon, the fires were contained. Stone Town's inhabitants emerged from hiding to find their sultan's palace in ruins, but the rest of the city largely intact. One notable absence in the aftermath was the would-be sultan himself. Khalid bin Bargash was nowhere to be found in the smoldering palace. Unbeknownst to the British at the moment of surrender, Khalid had fled the battle early on. When it became clear the palace would not withstand the British onslaught, Khalid slipped out through a back entrance with a small entourage of close advisors and bodyguards. They hurried across the palace grounds and through the winding streets to the German consulate, a secure sanctuary on foreign diplomatic soil. German officials, sympathetic or simply keen to embarrass the British, offered Khalid refuge. By the time British troops entered the wrecked palace, Khalid was under German protection, beyond their immediate reach. Of course, the British were determined that Khalid should not evade punishment. Sir Basil Cave and General Lloyd Matthews quickly ordered the German consulate surrounded. Zanzibari Askari troops loyal to the new order cordoned off the compound, and demands were issued for Khalid's surrender. However, international law was on Khalid's side. So long as he remained within the consulate, he was technically on German territory. The German consul, Mr. Albrecht von Reckenberg, politely refused to hand Khalid over, citing Germany's legal right to shelter political refugees. The standoff dragged on for days, then weeks. It seemed Khalid, might simply wait out the British as soldiers stood guard outside the white walls of the consulate day and night, unable to seize him without provoking a diplomatic crisis with Germany. At last, an ingenious solution was devised by the Germans. On October 2, 1896, over a month after the war, an Imperial German Navy warship, the SMS Siedler, steamed into Zanzibar's harbor. The British watched warily but could do nothing as the cruiser dropped anchor. That morning, at high tide, A contingent of German sailors brought one of Seidler's small boats ashore. In a carefully choreographed move, they carried this boat on their shoulders through the streets to the German consulate. There, at the gates of the consulate's garden, Khalid bin Barghash stepped directly from German soil into the boat. The sailors then lifted the boat and carried it back to the harbor, with Khalid sitting inside. They delivered him straight to the Seidler without his feet ever touching Zanzibar's ground. Beyond the consulate, from the German ship, Khalid was transported to the mainland, arriving in German East Africa, Tanganyika, where he was granted asylum. The British, furious but unwilling to risk an incident with a fellow European power, could only watch as their fugitive adversary slipped out of their grasp. Khalid bin Barghash would remain in exile for many years. 2 decades later, during the First World War, when British forces invaded German East Africa, they finally captured him. Khalid was sent away to distant islands, first to the Seychelles, then to St. Helena, to ensure he posed no further threat. Eventually, he was allowed to live out his final years back on the African coast, passing away in 1927. But in the days and weeks after the War of 1896, his immediate fate was simply that of a defeated usurper whisked into exile, while others now decided Zanzibar's future. With Khalid gone, the British wasted no time in installing their preferred candidate as Sultan. On the very day the war ended, 27th of August, 1896, a new Sultan was proclaimed under British auspices. Hamoud bin Mohammed, a cousin of the late Sultan Hamad, and known to be friendly to British interests. Hamoud had in fact been waiting safely under British protection during the conflict, and now he was ushered to the throne. However, his authority was effectively nominal. Real power in Zanzibar now lay firmly in British hands. The Protectorate entered a new phase of even tighter British control. To avoid the expense of direct colonial administration, the British kept the Sultanate intact as a client government, but it was a government in name only. Sir Basil Cave was soon promoted to Consul General, and along with General Matthews, who became the Sultan's first minister and commander of the army, they ran the administration behind the scenes. Sultan Hamoud served as a figurehead who would, as expected, cooperate fully with British directives. Under the new regime, policies that had stalled under Khalid were swiftly enacted. Most notably, Sultan Hamoud, at British urging, formally abolished slavery in Zanzibar in 1897. The slave trade on the island had been outlawed years earlier under British pressure, but the institution of slavery still persisted in domestic form. Now, with a stroke of the pen, Hamoud decreed the end of slavery itself. The decree required enslaved people to present themselves and register for freedom, an imperfect and gradual process, but nonetheless a landmark change. Thousands of Zanzibari slaves gained their liberty in the ensuing years, albeit slowly and often still under the economic power of their former masters. The abolition of slavery removed one of the moral justifications Britain had long used for its dominance over Zanzibar. The costs of the brief war were also settled in telling ways. The British presented Sultan Hamoud's government with a hefty bill for the bombardment. Khalid's supporters in the Zanzibar state were forced to pay reparations amounting to 300,000 rupees, covering the price of the shells fired and damages caused by the unrest. In essence, Zanzibar's new rulers paid for the very act of their own subjugation. Economically, the island remained dependent on its trade, especially the export of cloves and other spices, and British oversight of finances grew tighter. Over the coming years, British advisors oversaw reforms in taxation, infrastructure, and commerce to further integrate Zanzibar into Britain's imperial economic network. In Zanzibar town, the physical scars of the war slowly healed. The ruins of the old palace and harem, deemed unsafe, were demolished in the months after the conflict. The site of the main palace was converted into a garden adjacent to the new sultan's residence, and a smaller palace was later built on the site of the former harem building. The landmark ceremonial hall, known as the House of Wonders, which had survived the bombardment with only minor damage, was repaired and soon repurposed as the central administrative offices for the British authorities. During renovations in 1897, a large clock tower was added to its facade, replacing a lighthouse that had been destroyed by shellfire, a symbolic new feature for a new era. For years after the war, the masts of the sunken Glasgow could still be seen poking above the harbor's waters at low tide, a rusting reminder of the brief conflict. The wreck would not be fully salvaged until 1912. News of the Anglo-Zanzibar War and its astonishing brevity spread around the world. In Britain, the operation was hailed as a swift and successful policing action with minimal casualties. Officers like Admiral Rawson and Consul Cave were commended and showered with honors for restoring order in Zanzibar. Rawson received a knighthood, among other accolades, and others were likewise rewarded. In Zanzibar, life gradually returned to an uneasy normalcy under the new sultan. There were no further rebellions or open challenges to British authority in the islands for the remainder of the protectorate's existence. The overwhelming display of force in those 38 minutes had made British dominance indisputable. Zanzibar would remain under Britain's shadow for the next 67 years until the era of decolonization dawned. Legacy. The Anglo-Zanzibar War entered the record books as the shortest war in history. In the span of a mere 38 minutes, an age-old sultanate was decisively defeated by an industrial empire at the zenith of its power. Yet the brevity of this conflict should not obscure its significance. Those few minutes of cannon fire and smoke symbolized the overwhelming military and technological superiority that European colonial powers wielded over African states in the late 19th century. Zanzibar's quick defeat sent an unmistakable message to any who might have still harbored thoughts of resisting British rule. A single morning's battle entrenched foreign domination for decades to come. For the people of Zanzibar, the war marked the end of true sovereignty. The Sultanate continued to exist in name after 1896, but its independence was effectively lost. August 27, 1896 became the day Zanzibar's destiny fully entwined with the will of the British Empire. The shock and awe of the bombardment had imposed a peace of submission. In the years that followed, life on the island carried on under the watchful eyes of British officials. To many Zanzibaris, the war itself was scarcely more than a terrifying hour of their lives, but its outcome shaped the futures of their children and grandchildren. It ensured that their rulers would answer not to their own people or traditions, but to London. Broader historical currents can be seen in the Anglo-Zanzibar War. It was in many ways a microcosm of the scramble for Africa era, a confrontation where diplomacy, intrigue, and ultimately brute force were employed to consolidate imperial control. Britain invoked treaty obligations and high-minded ideals like the abolition of slavery as justification, but in the end, it was naval guns that decided the matter. The war demonstrated how even a minor protectorate could become a battlefield if it dared defy the empire's edicts. It also highlighted the cold calculus of colonial geopolitics. Britain and Germany, despite being imperial rivals, carefully respected each other's spheres of influence, as shown by Germany's crafty yet peaceful extraction of Khalid to avoid a larger confrontation. Zanzibar's fate was ultimately a pawn of these great powers' agreements, and when one pawn moved out of line, the response was swift and overwhelming. In historical memory, the Anglo-Zanzibar War is often noted as a curiosity, a war shorter than an episode of television, a conflict won in the time it takes to boil a pot of tea. But for those who lived through those violent minutes, it was anything but trivial. It was a morning of terror, fire, and thunder that left hundreds dead or wounded, and an entire polity forever changed. The war's brevity was matched by its decisiveness. It slammed shut one chapter of Zanzibar's history, the era of independent rule by its sultans, and ushered in another, dominated by foreign control. Zanzibar would remain under British control until the mid-20th century. Only in December 1963 did the protectorate finally come to an end, with Zanzibar granted full independence as a constitutional monarchy under the Sultan once again. But even that freedom was short-lived. Just a month later, in January 1964, a popular revolution overthrew the Sultanate entirely. The very dynasty that Britain had fought to keep compliant in 1896 was swept away by the will of the people. Zanzibar soon merged with Tanganyika to form the new nation of Tanzania, and the era of sultans and empires came to a definitive close. The legacy of the Anglo-Zanzibar War thus lies not only in its record-setting duration, but in what it represents. It stands as a vivid example of colonial power in action, a dramatic, if brief, display of force that achieved in minutes what diplomacy could not. It reminds us of how quickly the fate of a nation can be decided when one side holds an overwhelming advantage, and it offers a poignant lesson. Even the shortest of wars can cast a very long shadow. In Zanzibar, that shadow stretched over generations, proving that the consequences of conflict are not measured in minutes, but in the lives and futures it forever alters.